I actually started college interested in political science, really interested in government, which I'm still interested in. And I took a sociology class my very first semester. I was at Emory University, and we talked some about crime and criminology, and I found it fascinating. And then the second semester, I took this freshman seminar. I was on gentrification in Atlanta. I was in Atlanta, Georgia. And as part of that, we had to do a project out in the community. And I started asking people about their views about crime and safety. I did my first ride-along with the Atlanta Police Department, got to wear a bulletproof vest. And I just found the whole experience fascinating. And then I added sociology as a major, started taking classes, all the classes in sociology department that were related to criminology. I was really fortunate because Robert Agnew, who's a big American criminologist, happened to be in the sociology department at Emory, and I took several classes with him. And then when it came time when I was finishing up college, he was extremely helpful in making recommendations for me for graduate school, as I realized, oh wow, I really want to continue in this area. So it really came out of a few classes at the start of college that got me really interested in this. Yeah, I found that first experience fascinating, and from then on, I really was interested in policing, and I find police to be just a really interesting group to study. In the U.S., they have guns and this ability to use deadly force. They have a great deal of power. Obviously, similar to here, to the U.K., the ability to restrict people's liberty. And I find them an interesting group to study. There's a lot of them, a lot in the U.S. In particular. And so I was really interested in how I'd always been interested as a result of that initial ride along, and thinking about sort of how can they best do their job, how can they help keep communities safe most effectively. And so I was able to delve into that a little bit during undergraduate, but I was especially interested in exploring that more in grad school. And so I was looking towards, especially with Dr. Agnew's help, looking towards places that had sort of strong policing faculty that could help guide my studies there. And I ended up going to the University of Maryland for my master's degree to work with David Weisberg, who was a very good choice for me. And then I ended up actually moving. So at the end of my master's, he moved to George Mason. So I moved there as well for the Ph.D. As he was starting the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy. And that was a good move. It gave me an opportunity to continue to work with him, and a lot of wonderful faculty at George Mason, a lot of great policing scholars, Cynthia Lum, Steve Mostrowski, James Willis. So it was really a great policing education for me. Yeah, I think it is challenging. I mean, the very first thing I did in graduate school at Maryland was to work on a systematic review of problem-oriented policing. And so I spent a lot of time diving into the evidence on that particular topic, and an area where there's some evidence of effectiveness, which is exciting. And so from that on, I've been very excited and interested in sort of learning what works and ideally explaining that to police. But it is sometimes hard to get them excited. I think it's important for academics to not just try to express that in long articles that are not very interesting always to practitioners, or often are behind some paywall that a journal, that they can't actually access the articles even if they were interested in reading them without paying. And so I think it is, one part of this is packaging it and marketing it in ways that are accessible, whether that be websites or one-page briefs, or going to talk to police, going to conferences that practitioners attend and giving talks. But I think it is, what I've tried to stress in talking to officers and practitioners at a variety of levels is this is really about trying to make their job easier. So I'm not just doing this as an academic exercise. We want ideally police implementing things that work because it's going to help reduce crime and make their day-to-day work easier if there's less crime. So it's not just we're trying to make things harder for them by doing studies or things. We really want to learn what works best so that their lives are a little bit easier on the streets. So I think, especially in the U.S., and I assume similar challenges in the UK. Legitimacy has been a huge issue. Certainly in the US, we've had a lot of concerns about police use of force, police use of deadly force, particularly against minority citizens. And I think in a lot of communities in the U.S., police-community relations are really strained and have been strained for a long time, but that's really come out in recent years. And I think police feel that recognize that that's a challenge right now. And so I think thinking of ways to build community relations and build legitimacy are really going to be important for years to come. And I think I've been working on a project related to procedural justice, and there's a lot of other ongoing projects in the U.S. on this, and I think this is a really exciting area that police are excited about, thinking about ways to improve trust. I also think technology continues to be a big issue, so certainly that's led to other types of crime that police have had to deal with, and the challenges of responding to crimes where it's not clear geographically where it's occurring, if it's online fraud and things. It makes it hard for figure out who has jurisdiction. But also just police kind of trying to keep up with that, with the tools they use, and thinking about how that affects privacy and a whole host of other things. So I think those technological issues will continue to be challenges and potentially big opportunities moving forward for the police as well. Yeah, so the work I talked about yesterday is ongoing work on looking at how officers view research, what officers think about research and evidence-based policing. So we are continuing to collect survey data, especially at a project in the state of Oregon, where we're looking at how supervisors and mid-level managers view the research. Also working on a few other projects that tie into evidence-based policing. One is working with the Phoenix Police Department. They have what they call an intelligence officer program. So looking there at training officers on giving them extra resources to ideally gather more information in the field, and then importantly share that information. We know, and this is all happening at the front line, so we know that patrol or frontline officers often know a lot about what's going on in the community, but sometimes that information doesn't get shared. It's maybe in their notes, or they talk to a colleague about it, but it's not really shared in a systematic way so that it could be used. And so the goal of that project in Phoenix is to better share information so that special units and the department as a whole can better respond to more chronic problems and larger issues. And so we're in the middle of evaluating that, doing officer surveys, looking at the impact of the information that's gathered. And we're moving into a phase where we'll have these special an advanced intelligence officer school and special problem-solving projects. Excited about that. The other big thing I'm working on that I was just mentioning was a procedural justice project. And this is a project looking at procedural justice, particularly in the context of high crime areas or hotspots. And so we're doing this in multiple sites in the U.S., but the first site was in Tucson, Arizona, a few hours from Phoenix. And in that site, we trained one team of officers to use procedural justice in their interactions, and we gave them 20 hotspots or 20 high crime streets. So we really focused them to give people voice, be transparent and neutral in their interactions, treat people with dignity and respect, and really focus on showing care and concern to the community. And then we also had another team, and we gave the other team 20 high crime streets and didn't give them any special training and just told them to go out and reduce crime. So that intervention's over. We're currently collecting follow-up citizen survey data, so we'll be able to say whether residents on those streets noticed any differences. We can say we also systematically looked at officer behavior. We can say that our initial results show that the trained officers actually did behave in the ways that we trained them to, which was exciting. There's not a lot of studies of police training, especially of the impacts on behavior. So the officers that we trained did treat people with more respect. They were more transparent. They were actually listened when citizens were talking to them. So we think these are some positive findings, and then we're continuing to expand to 3 other cities. So this, we hope, will provide some important evidence about procedural justice training and its implications for legitimacy We'll also be tracking crime over time in these places to see if these projects have any impacts on crime, differential impacts on crime as well. Yes, hopefully in the next year or so we'll have a lot more data on the sites. And we're hoping at the end we'll have data from all 4 sites, and we'll really have a lot of information on. We'll have citizen surveys, we're doing household surveys door to door, we're doing telephone surveys of people that have police contact, with these officer observations, crime data. So it will be, yes, so I'd love to come back and talk about it again sometime next year for sure, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly we have, every county has a sheriff that's elected, so that's a very political position, in that the sheriff has oversight usually over the jails and the courts, and sometimes over law enforcement in parts of the county that aren't very urban. And so I point to the county I live in, Maricopa County in Arizona, which we had Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who is quite famous in the U.S. for not doing lots of things that were found to be illegal by federal courts. So he is maybe notorious in my neck of the woods. So sheriffs can certainly have big impacts. But yeah, absolutely. Even at the local level, oftentimes when you have a mayor's election, a new mayor comes in and he or she sort of feels like they have to select a new police chief to show that they're bringing in change with their new administration. And as a result, you end up with a lot of turnover in police chiefs, especially in our big cities. So I think the average tenure of a big city police chief is 3 years or less. And it can make sustained change challenging, because similarly, every police chief comes in, they're a little hesitant to do anything major at first. They don't want to rock the boat. And then maybe they get into a year in and they're ready to make some changes. They start some changes and then they're on their way out. So it can be difficult to keep reforms sort of in process longitudinally. But in general, we've had similar challenges too, in that many local jurisdictions have had, especially during the financial crisis, cut budgets, and that led to not so much usually police laying people off, but there were a number of agencies in the U.S. had multiple years in which they froze hiring. And so most police departments in the U.S. are down a lot just simply because of retirements. So they didn't hire anyone for 3 or 4 years. So they didn't replace anyone who quit or retired. And so at this point, I think with the economy improving, most departments are back in a phase of recruiting, but every department you'd visit in the U.S. would say right now that they are down from where they'd like to be and where they probably were in, say, 2008. And so it has been a challenge trying to figure out how to do more with less in some cases, because in many of these larger cities, the cities are continuing to grow, and the problems are continuing to be there, and so the department's having to deal with those with less officers. That's a tough question. That's a good question, though. I think it's been very interesting to learn about that, and as we talked about yesterday, it's a bit of a different landscape in the U.S., in which, if anything, departments are moving away from higher education requirements for entry. There's lots of officers in the U.S. that have higher education, but certainly no push for national requirements for higher education, or ultimately having graduates. I think ideally this will lead to some exciting things across England in terms of how people view the police, and ideally it will give the police some greater stature in the eyes of the public, and might improve legitimacy in terms of having professionals. I would say the police are already a profession, but education is often a hallmark of a profession. I think as well, hopefully it will bring to the force, if college education has the benefits that we think it does, although we need more research on this, as we learned yesterday at the Symposium, that should bring in better problem-solving skills, more critical thinking skills, officers who ideally are better able to work with diverse groups, the kinds of things that police have to deal with all the time, sort of tough challenges, tough problems. And so ideally these officers are going to come in ready to better handle those. It'll of course be important for the forces to give officers an opportunity to use those skills out in the fields and to reinforce that and support those skills. But I think it could be really exciting, and it'll be interesting to see over time. I'm sure it'll be a little bit bumpy at the start, but I think over time it could have some really exciting positive benefits. And so that's trying to sell that. I think that's challenging still, and especially challenging, we talked about yesterday, challenging to current officers. You don't want to tell them, well, all these great things are coming in and we're stuck with you. So, making it clear to the officers that are already on the force that their experience is valued, and that they can still be good mentors for these new officers who are going to come in still needing those skills about how to operate on the street. So I think ideally that everyone can mesh well together, but I think that, of course, will just be a little bit bumpy at first, but hopefully goes pretty seamlessly. Absolutely, and sort of the mid-level folks are kind of in the middle, as you might expect. But yeah, the chiefs tend to be pretty open to this, and some of the frontline workers. So a lot of our patrol level survey work suggests there's some general openness, but perhaps not quite the same understanding of research. Certainly not when we ask questions about whether they're reading publications or reading documents. The most common response in all of those questions is I'm not reading anything, and which isn't necessarily the worst thing. I mean, they're very busy, I understand that, but yes, chiefs are much more likely to be engaged with research in a way that that frontline officers tend not to be. Yes, one of the things I presented yesterday was that officers are most commonly learning about the effectiveness literature from their own agency, and we don't really know what that means because we don't really know what their agency is putting out, but hopefully the chief is putting out good information. So yeah, absolutely, if the chief is learning about new research and wants to disseminate that down the line, that would be wonderful. And so ideally there's a way that chiefs can be making sure that good information and research findings are getting out to their officers in easily accessible, easily digestible ways.